right, today I will talk a little bit to you about language issues in education. I say a little bit because it's obvious that I won't be able to do this complex and vast topic justice in the short time I'll be speaking to you. I want to limit my comments to a brief contemplation of why addressing language-related issues in any type of academic field, but especially in teacher education classes, is generally a good idea. I feel this is a good time for us to consider the question to what degree language matters in education, especially education that is ecologically oriented, because words, narratives, discourses, and their importance have come up several times these last 3 days. In fact, the power of language seems to be one of the threads running through many of our presentations. My interest in this topic stems from two different professional endeavors in which I'm engaged. I work as a foreign language teacher at a secondary school and as an instructor in teacher education at a university. In both instances, I take an EcoJustice approach to the content we learn, and I frequently draw my students' attention to language issues. This might seem self-evident for a language acquisition class, but it is not always what students in teacher education classes expect to be learning about. In this presentation, I would like to make a preliminary case for the active incorporation of language-related topics in teacher education, but of course, other fields can also benefit from this type of critical language awareness. As a foreign language teacher, one of my primary concerns lies with the cultivation of deliberate and thoughtful language use among my students. I want my students to respect other cultures and relate positively to different ways of speaking and being. I also want to help them uncover the worldviews that are to be found in the language systems and cultural practices in the new language we are studying. I really love this part of teaching a language because it usually leads students to challenge what they have been taught all of their lives. As a teacher educator, I want my students to go through a similar process so that they understand how dominant language practices benefit some more than others, mediate exclusion, and reproduce social and ecological injustice. This type of language analysis that has the potential to affect behavior is what I refer to when I say that I want students to cultivate responsible language practices. Ultimately, I want my students in both settings to come to think of their language and cultural practices as the result of their participation in a particular location at a particular moment in time. Language, in the sense I use it here, is both linguistic system and social practice. It is not set in stone, nor is it beyond critique. Thinking of language as a social practice empowers speakers. It means that speakers get to make choices, and when speakers make choices, there is definite ethical potential here. Chet Bowers explains that the cultural patterns shared within a language community generally are learned and reenacted at a taken for granted level of awareness. What I want my students to be able to do is to use language that disrupts harmful patterns at this taken for granted level of awareness. I'm particularly drawn to the definition of language found in EcoJustice education. According to Martusewicz, Edmundson, Lupinacci, language is a complex and creative process of differentiation that makes all meaning possible. Here, language makes particular ways of thinking about the world and our place in it more salient than others. To that end, Martusewicz et al. State that if our language map tells us that humans are separate from nature, it becomes difficult or impossible for us to see our interdependence with the natural world. Language, as understood from the EcoJustice perspective, focuses on the analysis of discourses. This is a list. I know you can't read that, but there are many. And the identification of root metaphors as symptoms of deeply held beliefs about how the world works. EcoJustice education offers educators the opportunity to orient their students toward responsible language practice as it relates to intersecting environmental and social concerns. So does Pennycook's work on language as a local practice and other scholarship in critical applied linguistics, critical discourse studies, and ethics. These varied approaches view language and identity as arising out of and constantly being renewed through relationships and material and social practices. The decision to address language issues in teacher education brings with it several other important considerations. First, that there is an ethical dimension to teaching, which requires educators to challenge current frameworks of dominant language practices. Second, that speaking and writing against the dominant stream is in many ways a daunting challenge. And third, that language has generative power. Language is never static. It adapts and arises in contexts. It comes into being as a result of interactions. How do these three realizations manifest themselves? My example for you today is a current linguistic development in France. I'm a French teacher, so I always look for resources, and this is something that's in the news in France at this moment. It's an example of both how difficult it is to change language practices, and at the same time how strongly people feel about the need to attend to the harmful element language carries. The issue is an attempted reform at changing French grammar to make it more gender neutral. In French, this would involve changing words such as word like human rights that currently refers to the rights of men to the equivalent in French of human rights. This reform would also eliminate the masculine generic. The individuals in favor of this initiative call this idea, the term is l'écriture inclusive, which means inclusive writing, and la grammaire égalitaire, egalitarian grammar. Opponents, mainly consisting of the Académie Française, a conservative institution, as we know, and various politicians, call the effort dangereux. Speaking and writing against the tide is in many ways a daunting challenge, as I said before. This is evident in our French example. Powerful institutions and influential public figures use their linguistic capital to preserve or introduce dominant, often harmful language patterns. Because mindless repetition can reproduce values that feed prejudice, hatred, and destruction, educators must attend to the ways in which dominant ways of speaking and writing benefit some more than others. Children deserve teachers who take a step back before repeating commonly reproduced language. Educators must also address how current language practices privilege dominant ideologies. Language needs to be a tool of imagination and hope. According to Mick Smith, in critical social theory, every utterance takes on social import in terms of either furthering the cause of the dominant ideology or striving to fracture its uniformity. Educators must consider the generative power of language as well, and the potential that exists to resist undemocratic ideologies by actively choosing to use language that promotes kindness and respect. It might help to think of language as the symptom, but not the disease, as a sort of vaccine, but not the cure. I'm very interested in the question of how language can become an indicator of a society that permeates with respect, kindness, and affection, and how language can mediate inclusion. The ethical dimension of teaching requires educators to address the current makeup of dominant language practices, their assumptions, their consequences. This is what French educators are doing when they refuse to value hierarchized gender, even in something believed to be as solid as grammar. Rosie Braidotti states that we need to devise new social, ethical, and discursive schemes of subject formation to match the profound transformations we are undergoing. That means that we need to learn to think differently about ourselves. Educators can play a vital role in responding to such a call for innovative thinking, speaking, and writing. Paying attention to language necessitates a fundamental shift in how educators conceive of their work. The shift must be based on hope for a better way of thinking, writing, speaking about our embeddedness within the natural world. One of the ways in which educators at all levels can accomplish this is through attention to and cultivation of responsible language practices. Braidotti continues, the pursuit of collective projects aimed at the affirmation of hope rooted in the ordinary micro-practices of everyday life is a strategy to set up, sustain, and map out sustainable transformations. Educators must understand that language as such a micro-practice reproduces injustices of all forms on a daily basis. Why should all teacher educators and their students care about language issues as crucial to teaching for justice? After all, teaching prospective teachers about curriculum, pedagogy, and social context can be done without asking students to contemplate the role language plays in educational contexts. It does not suffice to address only how we think and behave with the expectation that language practice will somehow simply fall into place. If we only do that, there's the danger of teachers who may know better, but unwittingly keep reproducing language patterns that reinforce values they don't necessarily even believe in anymore. Responsible thinking does not automatically equate with responsible language use. It is also true that responsible language use does not automatically lead to responsible thinking. But teachers who are aware that language influences our thinking, beliefs, and behavior, and who understand that discourses shape our worldviews have the potential to influence our language practices. It is clear that no one disputes that language constitutes the central concern of language acquisition classes or language arts curricula. However, when it comes to other fields, as Norman Fairclough remarks, for most people focusing on language will initially make little sense. The significance of language will generally need to be painstakingly demonstrated. It could be argued that not thinking or having to think about language is a form of privilege, monolingual privilege, analogous to invisible white privilege as articulated by Peggy McIntosh. To heed Fairclough's admonition to not fall into the trap of monolingual privilege, we need to consider the links among language, identity, culture, and community. Language, of course, is not the sole carrier of potential ethical messages. Mick Smith is generally critical of focusing strictly on language and culture as the locus of ethical decision-making. He argues that ethics becomes a wholly cultural phenomenon and one that can only be acknowledged insofar as it can be voiced. But nature communicates to us and through us in many different ways, through the early morning's light, the night's warm breeze, the bark's rough texture, the dawn chorus. This is a beautiful and convincing observation. However, the way he communicates these experiences to us still involves the use of words, although he goes beyond the usual ways our culture teaches us to express ourselves when he ponders the way natural processes have an impact on us. We may have those experiences, and they may be even more impactful than any language-mediated experience can be, but to share, which basically means to teach them, we still use language. In fact, the same experiences of perceiving natural phenomena could be clothed in very different language when reflected upon later. I tried to fit the whole book in on the slide, but it didn't fit, so that's it. But I recommend, do read the book, it's wonderful. As Michael McCarthy writes, with the vanishing of spirituality, we have become our own moral yardstick. At the heart of our notions of good and bad lies human suffering and what we can do to avoid it. This is so deep-rooted in us now, so instinctive, that it has been internalized in the language. One of our most prized virtues is humanity, one of our deepest tributes to another person, that they are humane. Our morality now is entirely anthropocentric. We automatically define objective good by what is best for ourselves. So where humanity's interests clash with other interests, the others are likely to get short shrift from us, even when they involve proper functioning of the planet, which is the only place we have to live. McCarthy draws our attention to the internalization, really also externalization through speech of beliefs in language. Here too, self-serving language can be understood to be a symptom of human hubris. In our critique, we cannot forget that language has generative power. Educators can teach about how to resist undemocratic ideology by actively choosing to use language that promotes kindness and respect. The French example of inclusive writing efforts is a good example of how language changes can potentially bring about changes in perceptions and eventually behavior. Traditionally, learning to teach is conceived of as fundamentally being about the learning of skills. Teaching skills include classroom management skills, lesson planning skills, communication skills, but also more all-encompassing analytic and literacy skills. But teacher education should be more than that. We must teach in support of just relationships and for understanding of our embeddedness in the natural world. Alistair Pennycook explains that once we accept that language is a social practice, it becomes clear that it is not language form that governs the speakers of the language, but rather the speakers that negotiate what possible language forms they want to use for what purpose. This fruitful definition of what language accomplishes helps us formulate a vision of speakers and writers who transcend dominant ways of speaking and writing that are so clearly symptomatic of deeper underlying problems with our very values. This is in line with EcoJustice education's focus on challenging unhealthy ways of thinking. Martusewicz et al. State, language shapes thought, but it is always possible to shift how we think and thus how we behave relative to one another by using different ways of describing or representing the world. The EcoJustice framework, with its focus on discourses of modernity as inherent in Western discourse, can provide a counter-discourse strategy, so to speak, that is needed to address the aforementioned problematic humanist subject in secondary schools, universities, and other educational learning communities. As an approach that seeks to uncover assumptions, EcoJustice education is also in line with the concept of sustainability literacy. Stibbe and Luna remark that as people gain sustainability literacy skills, they become empowered to read society critically, discovering insights into the unsustainable trajectory that the society is on and the social structures that underpin this trajectory. But more than this, they become empowered to engage with those social structures and contribute to the rewriting of self and society along more sustainable lines. This critical reading of society is essentially about being aware of the many functions of language and the way languages can be employed for different purposes. The generative aspect of social critique is also put front and center when Stibbe and Luna refer to a rewriting of self and society. The EcoJustice framework encourages critical discourse studies as a qualitative method of inquiry. The field of critical discourse studies combines language awareness, social theory, and ethics. According to Wodak and Meyer, critical discourse studies approaches are characterized by the common interests in deconstructing ideologies and power through the systematic investigation of semiotic data, written, spoken, or visual. As with sustainability literacy, as articulated by Stibbe and Luna, critical discourse studies can be a method that helps educators. EcoJustice education does not shy away from bringing intellectually challenging theory to prospective teachers' attention. An ecological cultural analysis is based on understanding centric thinking. According to Martusewicz et al., centric thinking is the tendency to give higher value to a concept that is more central than another, as in the example androcentrism, male-centeredness, which puts man as more central or important or valuable than woman. Teachers need to be aware of how centric thinking underlies dominant language practices. This might be helpful for French educators as they attempt to implement the so-called gender-neutral language. In any case, what we need is more theory, not less. In a neoliberal context in which time is money, asking prospective students to write pages upon pages upon pages, my students would keep going on, of their vision for education is an increasingly more difficult idea to sell. Yet as a practicing teacher myself, I know that having a strong vision is what sustains me when I become tired and overwhelmed, when my pension and health benefits are threatened, and I hear disrespectful comments about teachers from acquaintances. We need more theory, not less. We need to pay more attention to language, not less, because we need to understand why. And this is what I tell my students who want to become teachers, who may doubt that theory is useful to their future lives as teachers. When educating for healthy and just communities, we teach away from prejudice and toward fairness, away from disrespect and toward reverence, away from egoism and toward care, and away from self-centered individualism and toward altruistic individuality. In order to break down hierarchies and increase awareness of the multitude of needs that must be met in our communities, we need new ways of thinking and decision-making, of speaking and writing, that will help us articulate and commit to a standard of well-being for all. In order to articulate these responsible ways of thinking and decision-making, educators need to model the same responsible language practices. As all of us know, language carries consequential meanings, and how we express ourselves is very telling about what values we hold. Leaving no expression or metaphor unturned and unchallenged should be a priority for educators, no matter their subject area. Ethically grounded language shapes our thinking, connects to larger discourses, and contribute to more just habits of mind. Thank you.